I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first TrinityU for our school year. And it's always a blessing to be able to have our community come together and on an evening like tonight, learn together as a community. And for those of you, this might be your first TrinityU. Maybe you weren't able to join us last year. Just want to take a few minutes to explain a little bit about it. Mr. Ramquist, who will be blessed this evening to hear from as he starts off this year's TrinityU, speaking to the Master of Argument, Jesus Rhetoric. And Mr. Ramquist, this whole concept of TrinityU is Mr. Ramquist's idea in regards to how can we take what's happening in the classroom with our students and have those of us in our community be blessed by learning it as well, so we can continue to grow in our understanding and this whole idea of the classical Christian concept and what that looks like for us as we continue to mature as well. So we just continue to be encouraged by this concept of TrinityU and Mr. Ramquist helping organize and lead all of that. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Ramquist, this is his fourth year with us on our Rhetoric School faculty. He, along with Mr. Weichbrot and Dr. Selby, help guide our seniors in their senior thesis process as well. So let me pray for us, and we can just be encouraged to learn together this evening. Heavenly Father, we just thank you and praise you. It's just a privilege to be able to come together tonight and to learn. We are excited to hear from Mr. Ramquist and what he will be sharing. And Father, I thank you for our community. I thank you for the gift that you give us in the life of the mind, Lord, so that we can continue to grow and learn, understand the virtues that you want us to be understanding, that we can continue to grow in truth and understanding goodness and beauty, Lord, so that we can also, as the adults in our community, continue to pass that to the next generation. So we thank you and praise you. Amen. Mr. Ramquist. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I was going to say a few words also about what TrinityU is all about, but Mrs. Cato said it so kindly that the main thing I want to point out is that if you enjoy tonight's TrinityU session, there's more to come. Next month, we'll have Dr. Keith Buehler coming and talking to us about why everyone, even people who actually have jobs that make real money, might want to know and care about philosophy. So if you enjoy what you hear tonight and you think it might be beneficial, I'd be very glad if you would invite a friend to come along with you. Especially, these are great opportunities to tell and show family and friends that don't quite understand what we're doing at Trinity, what goes on here, what the students get, because the talks that we give are taken straight out of our classroom and only slightly repackaged for an adult audience. And it's just a wonderful way to introduce family and friends to what we do at Trinity and what makes our school such a special place. So consider that. To begin tonight, I primarily teach rhetoric here at Trinity. I teach a lot to our juniors as well as to our seniors in that senior thesis class. But I also get to teach some history classes, which I really enjoy. My academic training and background at the University of Notre Dame was in history. And as I study history, I'm always surprised when I find a fact that I thought I knew about the past turns out actually to not be the case. So for example, a few years ago, some researchers were studying the beautiful white marble statues from ancient Greece and Rome. And they did some ultraviolet scans on these statues and discovered that there were traces of paint pigment all over the statues. And it turns out that ancient Greek statues like this one, when they were produced and displayed in Greece, didn't look like this. They looked like this. They were covered with all these different paint pigments, and it's only over time that the paint wore away, leaving the white marble idea that we know today. That kind of blew my mind. Another idea from the past that I thought I knew was that Vikings look something like this. All right? Now, it turns out, especially with the iconic Viking horn helmets, that we have absolutely no evidence that Vikings ever had horns on top of their helmets. Here is an actual legitimate Viking helmet from the 10th century AD. The idea that Vikings had horns on their helmets, we can date it back to an 1876 production of an opera from Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle opera, with the fat lady singing. It dates from there and just spread throughout the popular imagination. One more historical misconception that I was surprised to learn about was perhaps you learned growing up that George Washington had wooden teeth. And by this point, you probably can guess where we're going now. This is actually a photograph of one of George Washington's set of dentures. And back in 2005, the National Museum of Dentistry in Baltimore got real curious to know what were those teeth made out of. Were they actually made out of wood, or what's the story? So they did some laser scans, and it turns out that this particular set of teeth were made out of gold, lead, hippopotamus ivory, as well as teeth taken from horses and donkeys. All right? Now, you may have heard some of these historical misconceptions before, and if you haven't, I'm guessing it's not exactly blowing your mind tonight to find out about these things. That, to put it in more traditional rhetorical terms, that you're not feeling very much resistance to changing your mind about these factoids. Maybe it's just a nice new fact to whip out at your next dinner party. But let's go back to the idea of George Washington's teeth. What if I told you, and this is true, about George Washington's other set of dentures? These false teeth that he had were not made from wood or ivory or other metals. Instead, he had another set of false teeth taken from the mouths of his slaves. Now, I'm guessing that fact maybe makes you feel a little bit more uneasy. You might feel a little bit more resistance and pushback to that idea, and you'd want me to provide more evidence, which, if you like, later on I can do. But the main thing that I want you to see is that when I pointed out one historical misconception, it was very easy for you to believe me and change your mind on that. But another idea, once again, about George Washington's teeth, you want to push back against it. You're not sure that you want to believe it. And the main difference is that the second idea about George Washington's teeth maybe challenges one of your core beliefs about who George Washington actually was. Now, I want to be really, really clear. Tonight, my point is not to make an argument about whether George Washington was a good person or a bad person. And for the record, I want to be clear, as a historian, I consider George Washington with utmost respect in terms of his generalship and his presidency as the first president of the United States. But I don't want to talk about 18th century dental care. I don't want to talk about Viking helmets, and I don't want to talk about ancient Greek statues. What I want to talk about is that feeling that you felt when I talked about and I mentioned something that maybe challenged a core belief. It turns out when we think about rhetoric, the art of trying to change people's minds, it's incredibly difficult to get people to actually switch their beliefs on things that really matter, about those things that are tied deeply into our ideas about the world and what we think is really true, about especially the most important things like politics and religion. There's a good reason that you're not supposed to bring those up in polite company. And this idea that it's really hard to change people's minds on the most important things makes it hard for us to make any progress when we argue with one another, when we try to persuade one another. And we can do a quick experiment to prove that this is true by thinking back, if you would, when was the last time you changed your mind about something important? I'll give you a moment. Try to think, when was that? On a really important issue. If you're like most of us, if you're like me, it's pretty hard to think of a time when you changed your mind about something important. And if you did, it was probably quite a long time ago. So, with that in mind, is it actually possible to practice rhetoric, to change hearts, minds, and actions? Of course, I think it is, but it's very difficult. And if we want to get better in this very difficult but very important art, I think that we should be learning powerful insights into how persuasion actually happens by considering the methods used by a master of argument to change minds and hearts about the most important issues. And that master of argument is Jesus Christ. So tonight, what I'd like to cover is, first of all, what is rhetoric and why does it matter? Second, why should we study Jesus' rhetoric? And third, how can we learn to actually argue like Jesus? So first of all, what is rhetoric and why does it matter? I have to admit that rhetoric doesn't have exactly the best reputation these days. When we hear about rhetoric at all, usually it's attached with the idea of empty rhetoric, or it's just rhetoric, something to be discarded. Maybe it's hot air at the best and empty manipulation at the worst. But despite rhetoric's less than stellar reputation, it does have a long and illustrious history. As a simple definition of rhetoric, I'd like to offer this idea. It's simply the art of persuasion. It's the way that we communicate messages, change minds, and cause action to happen. It's the art of leadership. That's another way that it's sometimes defined. And it's the core skill for politicians, lawyers, generals, and CEOs. And rhetoric is important because it's all around us. Oof, suddenly an explosion of rhetoric. Let's see if these happen one at a time or not, like they're supposed to. Oh, here we go. All right. Clearly, rhetoric is in political speeches and speeches in courts of law, but it also shows up in the academic essays that are written by students here at Trinity, as well as often college, and the papers written by professors. Rhetoric happens in the books and magazines that we read, in the newspapers that we read. It also shows up in TV and movies and commercials. Commercials are these little perfect bundles of rhetoric that are meant to persuade you. Rhetoric actually is even in the emails that we send, the posts that we make on Facebook, the text messages, and even in our everyday conversations. We are awash in rhetoric from almost the moment we wake up to our head on our pillows at night. So if this is the world that we live in, if we live in a world of rhetoric, then maybe it becomes a little bit more clear why rhetoric matters. But I'd like to go further and point out that rhetoric is incredibly powerful. As one analysis of rhetoric puts it, it plays with our emotions, it talks us into decisions, it makes us buy stuff. Rhetoric has been called the hidden software that drives our social lives. And if you don't know rhetoric, you don't know how it's being used on you. Throughout history, we have lots of examples of bad rhetoric being used to cause immense pain, to launch bombs, topple governments, install dictators, and incite genocide. But good rhetoric has been used to win battles, defend the vulnerable, destroy slavery, inspire imaginations, and express humanity's deepest truths. Rhetoric can be used to get people to like you, to trust you, and most importantly, to bring people together and inspire them for good purposes. And since rhetoric is so important, we teach a whole lot of it to our students here at Trinity. Starting in 4th grade, we begin the Progymnosmata program, which was the carefully sequenced writing and rhetoric program that was developed to train the greatest rhetoricians of the ancient Greek world, as well as the medieval universities and the Renaissance. And that whole process culminates in our senior thesis, in which our students will write a very carefully researched, persuasive paper of a length of 20 to 40 pages, and then present the ideas in that paper in a 10-minute speech delivered to a public audience, and best of all, delivered with minimal to no notes. One more reason that we think rhetoric matters, and matters maybe to you all in the audience tonight, is that since we teach so much of it to our students, Trinity parents might also need to know a little bit about rhetoric. We don't want you to be outgunned by your rhetorically nimble students and children. We want to make things a fair fight, all right? So, if these are all reasons that rhetoric might matter, why should we study Jesus' rhetoric in particular? Was Jesus the master of argument that I've claimed he is in the title of tonight's talk? And we might begin this section by thinking, did Jesus actually use rhetoric at all? And to answer that question, I'd like us to think about Jesus' ministry on earth. Clearly, the central act of his ministry was his crucifixion on the cross and his resurrection, in which he destroyed the power of sin and opened the pathway for our salvation. But beyond that act of crucifixion and resurrection, the majority of what Jesus was doing in his ministry was teaching, using words. He traveled around the countryside of Judea, talking as a rabbi, as a teacher. And he actually had these moments when he would stop and give full sermons to great crowds. Another way to think of a sermon is actually a speech. And there's some evidence in the Gospels that Jesus may have delivered the same speech or the same core of the speech multiple times to multiple audiences. One of Jesus' most famous sermons or speeches, of course, is the Sermon on the Mount, depicted in this painting here. And that shows up in Matthew 5, in which Jesus talks about the Beatitudes, about how to live the blessed life and how to have righteousness before God. Luke records Jesus giving a very similar set of Beatitudes and a similar sermon about how to live a righteous life. But in Luke's account, Jesus is now on a plane. And so it seems like Jesus had certain set sermons that he thought were so important that he wanted to repeat to multiple audiences so they could understand the truth. And so in this, it's clear, to me at least, that Jesus was using the arts of words and persuasion to try to change people's minds about the most important things. Who is God? How can I live a successful life? And how can I be right and justified before the eyes of God? Also, Jesus' most beloved disciple, John, when he sat down to write his biography of Jesus, his gospel of Jesus, he begins by identifying Jesus himself with the Word, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. To John's mind, words are deeply wrapped up into the core identity of who Jesus is. Now, that's a huge concept, the idea of Jesus as Logos, but hopefully it's clear that words and words used to persuade and make change happen in the world is central to what Jesus was about in his ministry on earth. One further question we should ask about whether Jesus used rhetoric was Jesus actually all that intentional in his use of rhetoric? There's an idea out in the world, but also sometimes creeps into our churches and maybe into our own minds, that Jesus wasn't actually that intentional when he was trying to persuade. That he was a holy man, but he was actually kind of a simple-minded man, a prophet, a salt of the earth kind of guy. He used all these ideas from farming and from laboring, and he maybe wasn't as thoughtful and intentional about how he spoke. I think we need to radically rethink who Jesus was when it comes to his level of intentionality in his ministry on earth, and especially when it comes to his words. I think on the basis of clear biblical evidence, we can conclude that Jesus was one of the smartest people who ever lived. And I use that word smartest really intentionally. I don't mean simply that he was one of the wisest people or that he was one of the best people. I really do mean that his cognitive mental faculties were as good as or better than anyone who ever lived or who ever will live, that he had an intellect on par with Shakespeare and Einstein. And to get into this idea, I want you to imagine a scenario for one of our logic schoolers, a 7th grader, on a family trip to Boston. And his family wants to visit Harvard University. And they lose track of their 7th grader, and he wanders into the philosophy department. Hears something happening in one of the doors, opens it up, and goes in, and there's a grad seminar going on in philosophy with some of the world's greatest philosophers and grad students. He listens for a little bit, puts up his little hand, and asks a question that blows everybody away. And then he proceeds to ask insightful questions and gives really great answers and offers new ideas that they've never considered before about philosophy and holds them captive for the rest of the 3-hour grad seminar. What would we think about this kind of 7th grader? This person must be pretty good. This is the equivalent of what Jesus did when he was 12 and when he wandered into the temple and held captive the minds of his generation's greatest theologians, philosophers, and legal jurists, not for 3 hours, but for 3 days straight. That's the kind of mind that Jesus possessed when he was a 12-year-old. We also get a glimpse into Jesus' intellect when we see his mastery of Scripture. It's clear that Jesus had vast portions of the Hebrew Old Testament at his beck and call. Perhaps he even had the whole of it memorized. That's not beyond his mental capacities. And we can see that in his temptation in the wilderness when he has exactly the right verse that he can quote to counter Satan's attacks. Also, I want to put before us one of the most important verses about who Jesus was in the book of Colossians. The book of Colossians is a masterful work that St. Paul puts before us about the nature of Jesus, Christology. And in Colossians 2:3, Paul writes, describing Jesus, that in him were hidden and are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I want to read that again because that blows me away. In Jesus are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Not just some of the treasures of wisdom, not just most of the treasures of knowledge, all of them. There is not any treasure of wisdom and knowledge that Jesus does not possess. I think that if we take this picture, this vision of Jesus seriously, it has massive implications for our discipleship to Jesus. Dallas Willard's one of my favorite authors. He was a philosopher at USC as well as a pastor for many, many years. And in one of his books, he wrote that the phrase, Jesus is Lord, can mean little in practice for anyone who has to hesitate before saying, Jesus is smart. You wouldn't want to work for a boss that you were smarter than. You would want your boss to be a pretty sharp person. For someone to have complete lordship over your life and to really trust them that their ideas, that their thoughts are what you should submit to, that person should be someone you can trust has really good ideas about how to live life, that has great insight to everything that you do. And our discipleship to Jesus changes when we realize that he has knowledge and deep insight into the hardest aspects of the problems that we face in whatever fields of inquiry we're involved in, be it philosophy or physics, engineering, robotics, biochemistry, film, fine art, music, mathematics, politics, linguistics, literature, and history. Jesus knows more than you in all those areas. When you go to work tomorrow, in whatever your field of technical or professional competence might be, you don't need to leave Jesus at the door. He can go with you into that field. when you are confused and when you are stuck and you have a problem to face, your first thought, my first thought, needs to be to turn to him in prayer and ask for his insight and his wisdom into whatever problem that is. So if Jesus is truly the Lord of all, including the Lord of our minds and our intellects, if he really is one of the smartest people, if not the smartest person who ever lived, we need to disciple ourselves to him in the way in which we use our words to persuade. We need to learn how we should use rhetoric, like he used rhetoric. So how did Jesus use rhetoric? The best way to understand how Jesus used words to persuade, I think, is to borrow a little bit of Aristotle's theory of persuasion. And to explain what that means, I need to tell you just a small bit of who Aristotle was. Aristotle lived in the 4th century BC, which is called the Golden Age of Greece. And together with Socrates and Aristotle's mentor Plato, those 3 philosophers are considered essentially the greatest philosophers in human history. Aristotle wrote many, many books that broke new ground. He's definitely a genius, and he literally wrote the book on rhetoric called On Rhetoric. That was the name of the book. And the theories in that book called On Rhetoric still contain the state-of-the-art ideas that are used today in rhetorical and communications theory. Rhetoric is one of these weird systems of thought that has not progressed or changed very much over the last 2,000 years since Aristotle wrote his book. Now, when we say that we want to use Aristotle's theories of persuasion to better understand Jesus' rhetoric, I want to be really clear that I'm not saying that Jesus was trained in Aristotelian rhetoric. Jesus was not a follower of Aristotle. I'm not sure if there's a way in which Jesus was a follower of anybody. He was a completely original thinker in many ways. But what I'm trying to say is that persuasion, the way that we use words, there's a fundamental truth about how words affect human nature and human psychology of persuasion. And Aristotle offered us unsurpassed insight into the nature of persuasion so we can fruitfully use Aristotle's theories of rhetoric to better understand how Jesus was so powerfully able to change minds and hearts. All right, so a brief primer on Aristotle's rhetorical theory. The main idea that Aristotle offered about rhetoric was this: that rhetoric may be defined as the art of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion. And he further went on to outline that there are these 3 main routes through which people are persuaded, that people change their mind. And he gave them these Greek words that maybe you've heard of before: Pathos, Ethos, and Logos. These are the 3 main methods by which people change their minds. So what I want to do for our remaining time is go through each of these means of persuasion: Pathos, Ethos, and Logos, and explain just a tiny bit of what those mean, and then see how Jesus used them to change minds and see what we can learn about how we can become better persuaders following after Jesus' model. So let's begin with Pathos. Now, what is pathos? Pathos is passionate or emotional persuasion. It's an argument of sorts that has the ability to make an audience laugh or cry, feel feelings of hope and fear, or maybe even make them burn with rage. And with my students, we talk about all sorts of different techniques that can be used to create those feelings in an audience in order to make them more open to persuasion. You can use humor, images, and imagery. If you have the chance, you can use music. Music is a wonderful way that makes people feel things. Try watching a movie scene without the music and then with the music back on and feel the difference. Also, figurative language like metaphors and analogies. And most of all, the number one way that we can make people feel things is through stories. So did Jesus use any of these techniques in order to help persuade his audience of true things? Yes, right? I'm sure you're thinking of many of these techniques that Jesus used. I just want to highlight two that Jesus used, to me, the most in his ministry and argument. So first of all, Jesus used a number of incredibly striking and poignant metaphors. A metaphor, to take you back to your 9th grade literature class, is a comparison from something that is known to something that is unknown. And it's a really important teaching tool for taking people into much deeper, trickier ideas and helping them see a complicated issue more simply. So in Matthew 7:5, Jesus is dealing with people that are very quick to judge one another. And he uses this very famous metaphor: "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Now, obviously, he's not saying there is a literal log in someone's eye. It's a metaphor, it's figurative language, and pointing out that before you can judge somebody else, you need to take care of the sin that is in your own heart before pointing out the sin in somebody else's. Jesus also used metaphors to help people understand who he was, this deeply complex idea of who the second person of the Trinity actually is. In the Gospel of John, we see Jesus using 7 I am statements, almost all of which are metaphors. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the true vine. Clearly, Jesus is not saying that he is literally bread, that he contains wheat and water and yeast, and he's not gluten-free. That's not what he's saying, right? He's making a metaphor about just like bread is so deeply important, especially in first century Judea, to everyday life, that you depend on it for your sustenance and your very being, so too Jesus is that kind of person that we need to depend upon. And so Jesus used these metaphors to, again, create these striking images and ideas to help people get into very, very complicated subjects. But of course, the main pathos technique that Jesus used repeatedly throughout his ministry was storytelling, and of course in the form of parables. These very simple sounding stories were packed with unforgettable messages. I merely have to mention their titles, like The Good Samaritan or The Prodigal Son, and suddenly the whole storyline comes rushing back to you, and important lessons and important images from those stories pop into your mind. That's how incredibly powerful Jesus' storytelling ability was. Jesus understood that pathos, this emotional persuasion, is incredibly important to actually changing people's mind. He understood what all rhetoricians soon realize. Facts and reasoning alone are usually not enough to persuade, to get someone to really listen, to have a chance to change someone's mind. You need to not only speak to their mind, but to their heart. And so we should, when we try to persuade, follow Jesus' model by using metaphors, storytelling, and other pathos techniques. So that's pathos. What about ethos? Ethos maybe isn't quite as straightforward as pathos, as passionate or emotional argumentation. Ethos is sometimes translated as an ethical argument, but the way I like to think about it is whether the speaker is being trustworthy, if they're credible, if you can actually believe what they're saying based on what you know about them as a person. A fundamental truth about rhetoric and persuasion is that we're only really persuaded by people that we trust. We don't want to be persuaded by people that look shifty, that might be wanting to scam us. But how do we decide who is actually trustworthy? Aristotle, when he talks about ethos, breaks down this complicated subject into 3 subcomponents. First of all, Aristotle says we trust people if they are wise, if they have relevant expertise and experience, if, in essence, they actually know what they're talking about. Second, we trust people who are good, who are morally excellent. We're not going to trust people who we know to be liars or who are enemies or scoundrels. And then finally, we trust people who have goodwill towards us, that are actually offering us things that we need for our own benefit and aren't trying to get something from us. They aren't trying to scam us or hurt us. Basically, we're persuaded by people who are wise, who are good, and who care about us. If you think back to that instance that I asked you to think about early on in the talk, about the last time you actually changed your mind, if someone else was involved in that process, chances are they were somebody that you trusted deeply. Probably a friend, I'm guessing, or maybe a family member, somebody who you thought was wise, good, and cared about you. Now, did Jesus use his ethos, his demonstration of his trustworthiness to persuade? Absolutely. Jesus used phronesis, his expertise in practical wisdom, all the time. He was widely sought out as someone who could speak with authority as a rabbi, who knew the scriptures backwards and front, and could teach powerfully about God. He had this clear wisdom that people wanted. Further, was he someone who demonstrated moral excellence? Of course. He had unimpeachable moral character. He was a man without sin. And then lastly, did he demonstrate goodwill? Yes. He was marked by his compassion and love for all, especially for the most vulnerable members of society, for children, for women, for the sick, for foreigners, and for sinners. There's a beautiful expression of Jesus' euonoia in John 10, where Jesus is describing himself and describing a comparison to false teachers around that time period. And he says, "The thief comes only to steal, to kill, and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep." And when we look to the cross, Jesus literally giving of his life for us, we see the ultimate expression of euonoia and goodwill for us. So Jesus' personal credibility was fundamental to how he was able to give such a huge following in his life, and people who are willing to give up everything, give up their jobs, leave their families, and even give up their own lives and be martyred to follow after him. It's almost so obvious that it's hard for us to see now, but consider, what if just one of these elements was missing from Jesus? What if he wasn't wise? What if he didn't know what he was talking about? What if he acted immorally? What if he spoke out of self-interest, manipulation, and greed? If any part of his ethos was lacking, his entire ministry and persuasive power would have been shattered. So Jesus used ethos to persuade. We should too. In order to persuade well, we need good phronesis, arete, and euonoia. To put it another way, we need to make sure that we are speaking out of wisdom when we talk, that we are becoming increasingly morally excellent through the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, and that we're not speaking out of self-interest, but we're speaking in order to be a blessing to the people who are hearing us. All right, so that's pathos, emotional argumentation, and ethos, ethical argumentation, or arguments from personal credibility and trustworthiness. What about logos? Logos is literally logical persuasion. It's what we think about what we usually think about when we think about arguments and persuasion. It's using claims and facts and evidence and reasoning to try to get people to change their minds. So did Jesus do that? Did Jesus use logical argumentation? Well, believe it or not, philosophers and people who study logic look through the patterns that Jesus used to persuade throughout the Gospels, and they can identify some classic logical techniques. Jesus uses the techniques of escaping the horns of a dilemma, a fortiori arguments, appeals to evidence, and reductio ad absurdum. And if you're interested, at the end of the talk, I can go through these and show you Jesus using some of these classic formal logic techniques. But instead of looking at these, I want us to look at an overriding logical technique that Jesus used most often when he was arguing. This technique has a name that at first might sound a little bit intimidating, but I want to explain what it means, how and why this technique is so powerful, and then show how Jesus used it so effectively in his ministry. And the name of the technique is called an enthymeme. An enthymeme. This is what I believe to be the primary logical technique that Jesus used to persuade. Now, if any of you happen to have taken a class in college in logic, you might remember this idea of a syllogism, all right? And hang in there if this sounds like gobbledygook for a second, all right? A syllogism is a formalized deductive argument, and the most famous syllogism of all time goes like this. I think you guys can get this. It's not that hard, all right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, the logical implication, inescapable, is Socrates is immortal, right? That's not too complicated. So that's a syllogism. An enthymeme, the technical definition of an enthymeme, is a syllogism with a piece missing. A syllogism with a piece missing. Sometimes I tell my students that it's a maimed syllogism, right? It's got an arm lopped off or something like that. All right, that again might sound a little bit complicated, but I think you guys get this. I think you'll get it. Let me give you another example, maybe a little bit easier to understand. All right, so here's an enthymeme now, not a syllogism. Starts off a little bit the same. All Greek women are beautiful, all right? My wife is a Greek woman, which is true, by the way. So, ... Yeah, I'm a lucky guy, right? I don't need to spell it out. You guys can easily supply the implied conclusion there. And that's what's happening in an enthymeme. We don't argue using formal syllogisms all the time, unless maybe we're philosophers. And I know enough philosophers to know that when they're at home, when they're off duty, they don't talk this way either. We use enthymemes primarily as the way that we argue with one another. I do this with my students. I say, if you don't study, you're going to get a bad grade. So, and that's all I have to say, and they get it, right? They get the unstated implied implication. Bumper stickers that you see around are great places to look for enthymemes. If you love your pet, don't eat meat. There's a lot going on there in terms of implied premises and conclusions. Real men don't ask for directions. Also has a lot going on under the surface. It's a child, not a choice. There's some clear implied premises and conclusions that bumper sticker wants you to get. And this is just the way that we mostly argue with one another. Now, if this is giving you a little bit of a sense of what an enthymeme is, why are enthymemes so powerful? I think that they get at a deep truth in persuasion, which is the person in your life who you find the most persuasive by far is yourself. Right? You are the most credible and trustworthy person in your life. Right? You don't trust most people. Some people are somewhat, for you, 100%, right? You think you have great ideas. Plato pointed this out in one of his dialogues when he's talking with somebody who he's trying to persuade, but is wanting to use enthymetic logic with him. And he says, can you be persuaded better than out of your own mouth? Right? You are the one who persuades yourself most often. A famous idea in rhetoric is that a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. You can't change your mind unless you really want to. And enthymemes give the space for you or for someone else to actually make that move, to change your own mind about something. Enthymemes are also incredibly powerful in overcoming one of the biggest challenges in actually making persuasion happen about the most important things. And that challenge is called the backfire effect. Remember back at the start, the example of George Washington and the idea of his false teeth. People naturally feel resistant when challenged in one of their core beliefs. Now, we didn't quite get to the backfire effect in that opening example, but you do get to the backfire effect if you're talking with someone and you start talking about something really important to them, like, say, politics, and you start piling on traditional logical arguments and bombarding them with amazing facts and reasons. Now, however clear and rational your arguments might be, what happens in such cases, almost always, is the person starts to feel attacked. They start to feel defensive, and they close up, and they prevent themselves from being persuaded. It actually gets worse than that. Studies have been done that in such cases, when someone's arguments for believing something have been utterly demolished what usually happens, not only are they not persuaded, they will walk out of that conversation believing their old belief, for which they now have no good evidence, stronger than before. That experience of having their old reasons and evidences demolished will actually reinforce their old belief. One researcher put it this way: when your deepest convictions are challenged by contradictory evidence, your beliefs get stronger. Part of the reason for this is that researchers have put subjects of studies into MRI machines and have fed them different arguments that have challenged core beliefs, and they see what happens in their brains. And the same part of a brain lights up when they hear these challenging ideas. The same part lights up as the part of the brain that lights up when the flight or fight symptom gets triggered. Now, the implication of the backfire effect is really, really troubling for persuasion. As I alluded to at the start, the possibility and almost the inevitability sometimes of the backfire effect makes it almost impossible for us to use traditional logical arguments to actually change someone's mind about the most important issues that matter. But enthymemes sidestep the backfire effect. One philosopher who studied enthymemes described the effect of enthymemes as follows. The significance of the enthymeme is that it enlists the mind of the hearer or the hearers from the inside in a way that full explicit statements of argument cannot do. The enthymeme's rhetorical force is accordingly quite different than that of fully explicated argumentation, which tends to distance the hearers from the force of the logic by locating it outside of his mind. Now, this is a really tricky idea, and when I try to explain it to my students, I found the best success by drawing an analogy from the movie Hitch. Do you guys ever see this romantic comedy? Will Smith is a date doctor. He's wise in the ways of the dating world, and his task in the movie is to help Kevin James, who plays this really hapless guy who's completely besotted by this beautiful, unattainable woman, and he's having to learn how to woo this lady. And at one point in the movie, it comes up that Kevin James's character is going to have his first kiss with this beautiful girl, and it just freaks him out. He has no idea what to do. So with Will Smith's character, his name is Hitch, gives some really classic advice about how to have a good kiss. All right, and at this point when I'm telling it to my students, they get really excited because finally they get to learn something practical in my class, something that'll really, really matter. So here's the advice in the movie, that when you're going in for your kiss, this is what the dating doctor says, you don't just go in and mash your face onto the girl and hope for good results, right? That's a good way to get pushed away and maybe get a slap, right? That's not going to be successful. What you do is you follow the 90-10 rule, all right? He says, you go 90% of the way and hold and just wait. And then if the girl is wanting the kiss, she'll come the rest of the 10% distance, cover the rest, and the magic will happen. So, okay, that's just a silly analogy, but I think there's a clear implication for how we need to argue and what enthymemes do. Enthymemes are like good kissing in a way, in a weird way. Enthymemes go 90% of the way and hold, and they give the space for the other person to meet you and to actually agree to your idea. They don't just force the argument into the face of somebody else and hope that they like it. That's a good way to get that pushback and the backfire effect. Okay, so from a bit of the ridiculous to the sublime, we need to ask the question, how did Jesus use enthymetic logic? Enthymetic logic simply means logic that uses these kinds of enthymemes. Once again, from Dallas Willard in his article, Jesus the Logician, Jesus' use of logic is always enthymetic, as is common to ordinary life and conversations. His points are, with respect to logical explicitness, understated and underdeveloped. I could point to many, many different enthymemes that Jesus used throughout the Gospels, but I just want to focus on 3 as we wrap up tonight. So the first comes in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist is in jail, and he sends some of his disciples to talk to Jesus. And John the Baptist wants to know, is Jesus actually the Messiah? And so his disciples come and ask this question to Jesus. And Jesus could have given a very simple answer. Yes, right? Yes, I'm the Messiah. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus has a very enigmatic response. Here's what he says. Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the good news is preached to the poor. What does that mean? What does that mean? That's the question that Jesus wants to give to John, and by extension to us as we hear this. All of these actions were prophesied in the book of Isaiah as the things that the Messiah would do. And so if we really wanted to, we could create a full syllogism by saying, if you do these types of things, you are the Messiah. And Jesus is saying, I'm doing these types of things. Therefore, and he leaves the space for John to come to the conclusion that Jesus indeed is the Messiah. Jesus' use of enthymemes is also really helpful when we consider an important apologetic question that comes up from time to time, which is, did Jesus ever really claim to be God? Sometimes non-Christians will look through the Gospels and find out that Jesus never utters the statement, I am God. You can look for it, it's not there. And so from that, they'll say, well, Jesus, was just this holy prophet, but he didn't have any pretensions to divinity, and that was something that was added later in by, Paul or other people later on. And if that's your interpretation, you're not understanding Jesus' logical, argumentative style, his use of enthymemes. There's a number of places we could go for this, but I think the clearest is in John 8. Jesus is talking with some people who don't really understand who he is, and he says this, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You're not 50 years old yet, the Jews said to him, and you have seen Abraham? I tell you the truth, Jesus answered. Before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. All right, what's happening here? There are some clear implications of what Jesus is saying. One implication that's kind of crazy is that Jesus was alive before Abraham was born. And Abraham lived around 2,000 years before Jesus is saying this. So a clear implication is Jesus is real old, right? He's at least 2,000 years old or so. That's not the thing that's really important here, though. What's much more important is the way that he ends his claim by saying, not just before Abraham was born, I existed, but I am. That's like a trigger word for the ancient Jews. They would have recognized that as the key formulation that their God, Yahweh, used to describe himself, his special covenantal name that he revealed to Moses in the burning bush, I am that I am. It's translated as Yahweh, or the tetragram of the four words, YHWH. And in your Bible, when you read the Lord, and it's all in caps, that's the word there, Yahweh, I am. And Jesus is using it to describe himself. He's equating himself, through this implication, it's clear, he's equating himself with Yahweh, the creator of all things, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And his audience gets it. We can tell they get it because they reach for stones, because that's what you're supposed to do if someone calls himself God, right? For anybody who isn't actually God, they're blaspheming, and the law requires them to be stoned on the spot. But Jesus is actually the only person who can say that without blaspheming. He's clearly calling himself God if you understand the force of his logic. All right, one last example of Jesus' enthymematic mode of argument. And this one isn't from a traditional argument per se, it's actually from parables. Jesus used parables frequently as a way to argue with people, where there was a clear implied conclusion from what he's saying. One of his most famous parables, of course, is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is found in Luke 10. And it stems out of an argument that Jesus is having with a lawyer, right? Which is always kind of a tricky thing to do, to argue with a lawyer. I don't recommend it, unless you are a lawyer yourself. And this lawyer is trying to pin down Jesus on the question of exactly how far his obligation goes to love his neighbor and thereby fulfill the second greatest commandment. So as Luke 10:29 says, but he, the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" At that point, Jesus stops arguing traditionally and tells a story. And he tells the story of the Great Samaritan, which I'm sure you guys have all heard before, but it's really easy to forget the shocking elements and the shocking conclusion to this story. The one who stops to help the beaten man by the side of the road is not the Levite or the priest, the ones who you would expect to help the beaten man. It's the Samaritan. It's the outcast, the despised foreigner, the guy who just happens to be passing through a bad part of town in a foreign country on a business trip. That's as far away from a traditional neighbor as you can get. But he is the one who acts as a neighbor. Jesus, at the end of the story, asks his enthymematic question: which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? The lawyer says, the one who showed mercy. He can't even utter the name Samaritan. It's such a dirty word to him. And Jesus says to the lawyer, you go and do likewise. There's an incredible implication here. Jesus implies that the question of who is my neighbor or who do I have to love is exactly the wrong question. The right question is, to whom can I be a neighbor? To whom can I go out and show love to? Jesus uses this logical, argumentative style throughout the Gospels. Willard, once more, says Jesus' aim in utilizing logic, it's not to win battles, but to achieve understanding and insight in his hearers. And this is also the way that we should argue. So, in conclusion, how can we become more enthymematic in our arguing and in the way that we argue like Jesus? Well, for some of us, I would like to challenge you that you might benefit from actually studying some logic. You can go out and learn how syllogisms work and then learn how to employ very carefully crafted enthymemes. Eventually, we might like to offer a logic course through TrinityU. But in the meantime, it's not too hard to pick up a logic book or to take a class online to better learn how logic works. But for all of us, when we try to persuade people, especially about the most important things, one of the big lessons to learn from Jesus is don't go in hot, trying to destroy your opponents with your reasons and with your evidence. Even if you're successful in doing that, you're only going to lead to the backfire effect. What's most important is to postpone traditional persuasion. Don't try to attack and persuade directly. Instead, first of all, seek to understand your audience. That's a fundamental rule in rhetoric, that you have to understand your audience before you can persuade them. And Jesus had a masterful understanding of everyone he spoke to, and his arguments, his enthymematic arguments, were tailored for each person he spoke with. Second, ask good questions, and not just leading questions that lead to exactly the point that you want to get to. Ask clarifying questions, questions that take you deeper into the heart of the matter and deeper into how the person you're talking with is understanding the issue. Many people don't realize that their own beliefs are actually logically inconsistent or unsupported by evidence. And if you very kindly ask them probing questions, you can help people realize and help them clarify some of the inconsistencies in their own thought processes. And that can be a really powerful experience of leading someone to a better understanding of their own thoughts and eventually to the truth. Again, Jesus is our model. Read through the Gospels and notice how many times Jesus has the opportunity to get into a traditional argument, but instead responds with a question. Third, we should be telling more stories. The implied arguments and stories are able to slip past an audience's defenses in ways that traditional argumentation never can. And Jesus obviously used this principle over and over in his parables. And finally, practice restraint in your logical arguments. Remember to give space for your audience to come to their own conclusion. Don't go that 100% of the way and force your arguments into someone's face. Go the 90 and leave them space to come 10. The last thing I'd like to say tonight, if you'd let me, is to look at one final enthymeme in the Gospels. And it contains what I think is the most frustrating verse in the New Testament. It happens with the story of the road to Emmaus. As I'm sure you remember, after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, some of his disciples are walking back from Jerusalem to their home in the town of Emmaus, and Jesus is able to somehow appear and walk up next to them and start overhearing their conversation. And they're just completely baffled by the crazy weekend that has happened with the crucifixion on Friday and the resurrection on Sunday, and they just don't understand what's going on. And Jesus is able to get himself into the conversation, and eventually he says to them in Luke 24:25, verse 25, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then there's this verse that is so frustrating to me. Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted for them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. Let me read that again. Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted for them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. That had to have been the best Bible study of all time. Imagine Jesus sitting down next to you and opening up the Bible and just pointing out, starting with Genesis, going through the prophets and just saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, look at this, look at that, right? What insight, what understanding you would receive. Did those disciples just suddenly forget it when they got done with that conversation? Or did they forget to tell Luke? Or did Luke know it and just not think that's important for us to know? Like, I would like to know that. What is Luke doing in that passage, right? Like, I would like the Gospel of Luke to be about 10 times longer and include that Bible study so that we could also benefit from understanding Jesus' own interpretation of himself in the Old Testament. That would be fascinating. Why isn't that there? Why? I believe that Luke, as he wrote the Gospel, was inspired by the Holy Spirit to keep that back, to keep that as a clue, to keep that in a way as an enthymeme, saying, look, all this is waiting for you. Our job is to go back through Scripture and find Jesus and hear him arguing to us. Jesus has come 90, but he's not going to go 100%. He's not going to overwhelm our wills or our intellects. We have the chance to read through Scripture and understand and believe. Jesus today is still waiting to speak to us and argue with us through the Bible. May each of us dedicate ourselves to being discipled by the master of argument. Thank you.